Hello, class. So today we're going to continue talking about the 2011-2012 TV season. Last time we talked about the successful new scripted shows. This time we're going to talk about the new scripted shows on the 5 broadcast networks that failed. Right? And by failed new shows, I mean they failed to get renewed. Right? Some of these ones a bit higher up, you could perhaps argue that the network should have kept them. So the way this works is that the adults 18 through 49 demographic is the one the advertisers want. It's the currency we're going to use, and it is really clearly the deciding factor when it comes to what shows are kept and which aren't. So on that ratings note, the average rating for broadcast networks during the season was between a 2.3 and a 2.4 for ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox. The CW had much lower standards. The Vampire Diaries was the only show that would stay above a 1 the entire season. All right, so we're going to go from the highest ratings average to the lowest ratings average. And the way that this works, though, is that some shows get burned off, as in they will air them in the summer or on Saturday afterwards, right? And so we're not, so they have lower averages because of that. And if your show got pulled and they never aired some of the episodes, that your average might be a bit higher. So here's Rob, right, which is stylized with the Spanish exclamation points. Right, this is a multicam comedy. Rob Schneider being an outsider in Hispanic culture. Its time slot was Thursdays at 8:30. So that was airing after The Big Bang Theory, before Person of Interest. So if you look at this ratings average, 3.3, and it's like, oh wow, that is higher than all but one show that got renewed. I only one higher than that is Two Broke Girls. But you have to take into account the fact that it had a very short episode order, I believe 8 episodes, and it was airing after The Big Bang Theory. And so it debuted at a 4.1, which was pretty solid for it. But The Big Bang Theory was really hitting its stride at this point, and it was making headlines about, beating American Idol head-to-head. And then when Rob aired after a rerun of The Big Bang Theory, which was still pretty strong, it dropped to a 2.6. So CBS ends up just not bringing it back. And I think it probably would have been fine if they did bring it back, but they didn't seem to even like the show very much. All right, our next one is an animated comedy, Napoleon Dynamite on Fox. All right, so this is based off of the very low budget film that became a cult comedy classic done in an animated style. And this also, like Rob, had a very short episode order. And I've seen people talk about this show's failure and be like, yeah, well, no one cared about Napoleon Dynamite at that point. It was too far. I want to see it. But a lot of people watched the first episode. Right? So the way that it debuted was it was a night in which Fox had the lead-in from an NFL playoff game, which, while not Super Bowl levels, is higher than it typically is on an NFL night. Right, so you got a huge episode of The Simpsons leading into it, but Napoleon Dynamite debuted to a 4.4. Then Family Guy was right after it. Family Guy maintained that audience. And then Napoleon Dynamite dropped to a 3.3. And then it had to air the rest of its time between The Simpsons and Family Guy. But with all the scheduling that was going on, it only aired 2 weeks in a row once, off and on, off and on. So it ends up with a pretty decent ratings average, but a lot of that is inflated by its original run. Now, at this point, with the shows that it's competing against for that 8:30 slot, right? Whether it be returning shows like the Cleveland Show or Bob's Burgers, right? There really isn't much separation of these shows ratings wise, but the way the production works with animated shows is they have to pick quickly. And so Napoleon Dynamite, it just airs this run and is mostly forgotten. All right, our next show is Terra Nova on Fox. So Terra Nova was an interesting thing because today we're streaming and everything. We're quite used to like blockbuster budgets for television shows. Right? And streaming services that were willing to pay ridiculous amounts of money episodes. Terra Nova had a blockbuster budget. And so the idea was you pay all this money for CGI, and the viewing public will reward you by having a must-watch show that's going to have high ratings, and the ad revenue is going to pay for it. So Terra Nova, right? So they go back in time. There's dinosaurs, right? This is the premise. So the time slot is Monday at 8 p.m. It started with a 2-hour episode, and it debuted at 3.1, which is, again, would be a good number for the middle of the season, but for something as high profile as Terra Nova, it was kind of disappointing. Well, the next week, it aired after House returned, airing after it, and it held up, and then Terra Nova was kind of just there. One night it had to air late because baseball pushed into it. It got preempted for the World Series one time. But it was basically in the low to mid twos. And if this was just a regular drama on basically any other network, this probably would have gotten renewed. But it was a very expensive drama. And so to end up with just a little bit over average ratings for a show that was more than just a little bit over average in cost meant that it was done. Now, when they got canceled, there was talk of Netflix picking it up. And if this was like 2-3 years later, Netflix probably would have, but they weren't really in the originals realm the way they are today, or even just a few years after that. And so it ends its run being decently rated, but just too expensive. So a show with kind of a similar setup here is Alcatraz on Fox, right? So we got another genre show going here, and it's a kind of mystery happening and supernatural, right? So it has Lost alumni in it. It's kind of replicating that idea, right? So its time slot was Monday at 9 p.m. So they shifted House down back to 8 to launch it, and Alcatraz gets a lot of promotion during like the NFL playoffs, and it launches really well. It launches with a 3.3. It's actually larger than Terra Nova, which I don't think Fox would have predicted before the season started. But the show just never stopped dropping. Now, some of that was because House went into reruns, or it aired like 2-hour episodes near the end, but it kept on just going down and down to the point when it ended around a 1.5, it was like you're on the wrong side of the bubble. Right? These type of shows, even if they do really well their first season, they have a hard time replicating that success in season 2. So when you see a show lose over half its ratings within a season, it's done. All right, here's another one on Fox. Right, Fox is kind of dominating the higher rated cancellations. Alan Gregory. All right, so this is a similar thing to Napoleon Dynamite in the sense at a very short order, 6-7 episodes, and they didn't launch it until the end of October, but they had it set up super well, where the first night it was going to air after The Simpsons in their highest rated episode of the season, typically the Treehouse of Horror episode. Then the next two nights, Fox was going to be happenstance have NFL lead-in. So it goes in there and only debuts to a 2.4. That's way below what The Simpsons is doing, way below what Family Guy is doing, below what American Dad is doing 9:30, and it's dragging the lineup down. And then once there's no NFL lead-in, it drops to 1.5. Family Guy had its lowest ratings since its original cancellation, and so Fox replaces it. Replaces one of those episodes with the Cleveland show, which they had put at 7:30, kind of banished, and it returned. So part of the reason that, to this point, the previous season, Bob's Burgers had been renewed, but it was on the bubble. And what's going to help Bob's Burgers get renewed and then continue today is the fact that Fox bombed out 2 shows in a row with Alan Gregory and Napoleon Dynamite. So the devil you know. Okay, so when we talked about the successful shows that had last time, one of them was Apartment 23 because ABC couldn't say a swear word on the air. And amazingly, ABC had 2 of these programs in a single season. So this is GCB. Okay. Right. And this ends up becoming a bit controversial because it was supposed to stand for good Christian and then a swear word, right? And then they tried to make it mean good Christian bells, but there were candidates on the Republican side for president that were criticizing this show for apparently criticizing Christians, right? So that is up. So it did get some controversy. So its time slot was Sunday at 10 p.m. It was airing after the final season of Desperate Housewives. Desperate Housewives had seen quite a bit of decline at this point, but its rating average is a 1.92. So it's only about a tenth lower than Scandal, and Scandal got renewed. So it debuted at a 2.2. It rose to 2.3 in the next week. But it got to air on its own a couple times, and it was lower. And so they decided just not to keep it. I don't think the controversy helped it. It was another time where it's just, what were they thinking with the name if you're going to air this on broadcast? All right, this is a show I completely forgot exists, but it did air. It's called Man Up. All right, so this was a program that was paired with Last Man Standing, right? And I think the idea was they both have man in the title. So its time slot was Tuesday at 8:30. After Last Man Standing had a big debut with a 1-hour episode, it went to a half-hour episode, and Man Up aired after it. It started at 2.4, it got as low as a 1.6, so rating average 1.85. It was losing quite a bit from Last Man Standing, and so they decide just not to add any episodes to it. Now, here's the thing. It did show that you could immediately do worse, because what they replaced Man Up with is possibly the worst concept that has ever aired on television, which was Work It. The premise here is that the job market is really hard for men during the Great Recession. So 2 men have to dress up and drag and pretend to be women in order to get a job. So this debuted after Last Man Standing in January, and its first episode did a 2, which is about where Man Up probably would have done at that point. Then the next episode dropped to a 1.5, and ABC pulled it, and they never aired the rest of the episodes. They are available online. So its rating average is literally just 2 episodes. So it did show that you could immediately do worse for this. Okay, so Fox aired this show. It was called I Hate My Teenage Daughter. And what was happening is they had the X Factor as a new program, and the X Factor's performance show was 2 hours long, and then they were scheduled to have it decreased to 90 minutes later in the season. This is something that used to be pretty common for shows like Dancing with the Stars, American Idol to do. Now they don't do that. They just pad it more filler. And so this is airing at 9:30 on Wednesdays originally for 4 episodes after the X Factor. So there's basically 2 runs here. It debuted with a 2.8 and then immediately had a big drop. And so that 4 episode run averaged a 2.18, which is you're barely doing half of the X Factor. Then it popped up later in the season with Fox's like Frankenstein's Monster put together comedy block on Tuesday, and it's airing between Raising Hope and New Girl, and it showed up with a 1.6, then a 1.4, then a 1.2, and then they pulled it for reruns of Raising Hope, or New Girl, whatever. It did better. The reruns did better. So there's only 7 episodes of the show that aired. They aired in 2 different time slots, and it didn't do well anywhere. But that's not the way you want to schedule a show. Right? If there was any hope that it might have an audience inside the X Factor, you needed to not wait several months before airing it again the way they did. Okay, so when programs like Dancing with the Stars and The Survivor are going, they air 2 cycles in a year. But there's a gap between the 2 cycles, so they need some show to fill it. So what they chose to fill the slot for the Dancing with the Stars results show for ABC was supposed to be a supernatural horror drama called The River. And so The River had a 2-hour premiere. Right, and it's actually, I believe it was airing out of the premiere of Work It, like terrible setup, but it did decently, right? It was 2.4, just something like this. But it's just comically incompatible with the comedy block. It drops every single week until it bottoms out at 1.3. So at a short order, ends up with a 1.74 average. Gonna get mostly forgotten. Okay, so now we have The Finder. The Finder is an interesting thing because it's based on a series of books. However, Fox didn't think that was enough, so they made it a backdoor pilot of their show Bones. Now, Bones has a very long run, but it's never really a hit show in the sense that it's always doing solid work, but never a big hit. But so they kind of tied this together for Bones. But Bones also has a big hiatus this season due to a pregnancy. And so it's going to air Thursdays at 9 p.m. And so it's kind of a weird thing. The first episode airs after episode of Bones. And then the next set of episode airs after American Idol. And so while it's more compatible with Bones, because it's a spinoff, American Idol is a lot bigger. So it actually grew its first 3 weeks. It got as low as it started at 1.7 after Bones, got all the way up to 2.8, which was still like doing half American Idol. And so it was airing after American Idol, averaging a 2.23. So it was a little bit below average rated show after a big thing. And then they aired the rest of its season. They moved it to Friday at 8 p.m., which was basically a burn-off. It debuted at a 1.2. It got as low as a 0.9. It averaged a 107, right? So this is less than half of the average program at this time. So, I mean, you can't say that it didn't get a chance because it aired after American Idol, but its connection to Bones was pretty weak, and Bones itself wasn't really a product to spin off. All right, here's Pan Am. All right, so Pan Am is based on it was a period drama about air stewardesses, and basically the most notable thing about it is that before Margot Robbie became famous as Harley Quinn or Barbie, she was on the show. And so its time slot was Sunday at 10 p.m. It was airing after Desperate Housewives. And for its first episode, it held all of the adults 18 through 49 lead in from Desperate Housewives, and then increased in total viewers, right? Because it was a period drama. But then it just kept on dropping, right? And it got to a point which was pretty ridiculous that there was an episode that aired against the Grammys that happened right after Whitney Houston died. So they were the highest rated Grammys in a very long time. And so Desperate Housewives hits its lowest rating ever. So it's at a 1.8. And then Pan Am drops all the way to a 0.7. Right? Like, this is a CW type level rating. It's at a time where most shows are breaking a 2. It's all the way down to a 7. So just ends up being a massive, expensive flop. Are You There, Chelsea? Right. So this is from Chelsea Handler. The title is supposed to be based on a memoir. Are You There, Vodka? It's Me, Chelsea. And NBC execs were concerned about having vodka in the show's title. So it's Are You There, Chelsea, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And Chelsea plays her older sister, and not herself, but an actress playing herself. But this was airing starting in January at 8:30. It's a multicam. It was airing alongside Whitney, and actually it has a pretty decent debut. It's a 2.3. It's growing out of Whitney at a 2. Then they keep on dropping, but it was basically holding the average rating that Whitney was doing until the end. The bottom really drops out for it, ends at a 1.1. So then it is canceled. Okay, so in the fall, ABC had a troubled time slot. They had a lot of one-season shows that were airing Thursday at 8 o'clock, the time slot before Grey's Anatomy. They had the rest of that night pretty well done. So they tried to have something they could self-start in the season. They have Charlie's Angels. Right? So they remade the old television show from the 70s. And so started Thursday 8 p.m. and it debuted at a 2.1. Right? And just to give some context there, 2 years ago, Flash Forward had debuted at a 4, and then the year later, My Generation debuted at a 1.4. So it wasn't quite as a disaster of My Generation, but less than half of Flash Forward, half to Flash Forward 2 years later. It wasn't good. It skewed quite old, and it kept on dropping all the way down to a 1.1. ABC actually announced it got canceled and then kept airing it in this time slot for 4 or 5 episodes. And what's interesting here is this was a disappointment because this was the thing that had the intellectual property. The thing that replaced it also is going to fail, but it's going to do better. There's a show called Missing. Another show about someone being kidnapped. So this is what replaced Charlie's Angels, Thursday 8. It debuted at a 2.1, which was the same as Charlie's Angels, which much less promotion. It has a slightly higher ratings average of 1.45, but it kept on declining throughout its run, got as low as a 1.1. This was really not in a bubble range. Right? So they're going to get canceled, and then ABC is going to try again and have several failed programs next season, also in this time slot. All right, a prominent flop here was the Playboy Club from NBC. And this was one where there was their affiliate in Salt Lake City refused to air the program. There was controversy around this, and basically for no reason, because it didn't get watched very well. So NBC brought the Sing Off, which had been a short order program, to be a regular show, and it doesn't do that well. But the Playboy Club airs after it. It only debuts to a 1.6. I guess as low as a 1.2, and then NBC pulls it. They don't even air all of the episodes. So, just like Panem, another expensive flop when it comes to this. Free agents. So, when we talked about Up All Night, they got renewed. Up All Night's trying to air on its own. And it's doing a decent job holding its own, 8 o'clock on Wednesdays. The show that follows it is Free Agents, and it does just terribly. It started with a 2.1, airing after a 3.7 from Up All Night. And then once it debuts as regular time slot, it's at a 1.4. It's as low as a 1. And by the end of this, the run, it gets replaced by reruns of Up All Night, and the reruns do better. All right, so this is kind of sad. And the show that's airing after is Harry's Law, and Harry's Law is not doing much better in the demographic than it, but it is getting a lot more total viewers. So it just looks really bad where it's at. So I'd say that if you wanted to launch a procedural drama, at this point, CBS was the best spot. So they have a medical procedural drama called A Gifted Man, and they're airing it Friday, 8 p.m. Right? And what's on this night is CSI New York and Blue Bloods. So stuff that's already skewing quite old, so they try to have it there. And it only debuts at a 1.4, which, even for a Friday, is not a good starting number in 2011. It does in January. It peaks to 1.5. It gets up there, but the damage is done on premiere night. It holds close to that, and it has a decent amount of total viewers, but it's on the same night as Blue Bloods, so it is not competing. So CBS does not give it another season. Prime Suspect, right? So this is a remake being done on NBC. And its debut, it's after Whitney, which is airing after The Office. So this is several levels of whiplash. And it debuts at a 1.8. And it says lead-ins Whitney, it's a 3.3. So that's a big drop. And, its competition is Private Practice on ABC and The Mentalist on CBS. And airing out of comedies, the audience is spoken for. It can't bring anything on its own. So it averages a 1.19. NBC burns off the last couple episodes where it gets as low as a 0.7. Now, I'll just try to speak to its replacement. So then NBC tried to replace it with a show called The Firm. All right, so based on the movie and the book by John Grisham. And this was a international co-production. It was supposed to be super cheap, but NBC dedicated 22 episodes to this. So they debuted on Sunday, then it's going to be on Thursdays at 10 p.m. It only gets as high as a 1.4, but then it drops below that. And so after just airing a couple of weeks, NBC will toss The Firm from that, and they will start airing it on Saturday, and they air out all of its episodes on Saturday going into the summer. So it's getting as low as a 0.3, which is just almost impossibly low to think about airing on NBC at this time. So The Firm, it doesn't make Prime Suspect good, but The Firm immediately proved that you could do worse. And so then they replaced Prime Suspect with this last show in the time slot, which was called Awake. All right, and the idea is Jason Isaacs, he has two realities. That way he sleeps in one, his wife's alive, the other one, his son's alive. All right, so it's an interesting enough premise. This is airing after Up All Night and then later Parks and Recreation at as their comedy lead-ins Thursday at 10 p.m. And there's an okay amount of interest for its debut, given what's happening to it. It starts at 2. But it just keeps on dropping. And they aired the last episode, 2-hour finale, right before Memorial Day, and it drops as low to 0.7. So, Prime Suspect ends up being the best rated of those shows. But it still didn't deserve to get renewed. But it's showing that you could always do worse. All right, so this program goes How to Be a Gentleman. Okay, so How to Be a Gentleman. And it aired 2 episodes after The Big Bang Theory. And The Big Bang Theory is in the high 4s, and it just gets a 2.7, and I think it's like a 2.2. It's in the 2s. And so CBS pulls it. The next week, they air a rerun of The Big Bang Theory, which does significantly better. And then CBS had decided in 2011 they were going to have an original comedy on Saturday, after abandoning Saturday about 8 years earlier. And so Rules of Engagement was going to air. But they were going to wait a couple weeks to do that. Well, How to Be a Gentleman bombed, so they ended up having How to Be a Gentleman be the one that aired on Saturdays at 8 p.m. So it aired a little bit of fall. They pulled it. They ended up burning it off in the summer, where it gets as low as a 0.3. So it isn't the biggest flop, but like it was a very high standards that they were having airing after The Big Bang Theory, and they just yanked it. All right, NBC had a couple of comedy flops that they seem to know were flops because of how they aired them. This is a show called Bent. Okay, Bent, I think it had an 8-episode order, and they aired them back-to-back episodes every week for like 4 weeks. So it was Wednesday at 9 p.m. It debuted at a 1. It got as low as a 0.7. So its average was a 0.83. So I believe its first episode was a 1 and a 0.8. And so it averaged out to a 0.9. So that was the first time that a network show had ever debuted below a 1. Ever. And like it's going to take 7 years after this before like CBS is going to have a comedy debut worse than Bent. Right? So it shows there. Then they also basically burned off a show called Best Friends Forever. Its lead-in was the Hidden Camera show, Betty White's Off Their Rockers, which did okay ratings. And then after it, it was Best Friends Forever, airing Wednesday, 8:30. It debuted at 1.2, immediately went under a 1, and they burned it off a bit at the end. It got as low as a 0.5. 0.78. And notice this, 0.78. It got canceled on NBC. This next show ends up with basically the same ratings average on the CW. Right? So it was called The Secret Circle. It's about witches. It came from the same creators as The Vampire Diaries. It was airing after The Vampire Diaries. Airing Thursdays at 9 p.m. And it debuted super well. Right? It debuted at 1.3. So and I believe Vampire Diaries is like a 1.6 that night. So that was a pretty solid rating for it. And then it just kept dropping all season. To its finale to like a 0.5, and the Vampire Diaries have like a 1 as its lead-in. And so it ends up getting canceled. Even though it's higher rated than some other shows that are in this at the time. And it was basically because the one place in which the CW had standards was airing after the Vampire Diaries. But still kind of amazing, given how low the average rating was at the CW, that you could have something like the Secret Circle. That 1.3 debut is better than stuff like Bent and Best Friends Forever. It's only a 10th below A Gifted Man in CBS. So if we're gonna keep on that, there was a show on CBS. It was called NYC 22. It was a generic police procedural in New York. And they had it airing after The Good Wife, and it was at Sundays at 10 p.m. And so it starts at a 1.5. It hangs out in the ones, and then CBS moves it to Saturday in the summer where they burn it off, and it gets as low as a 0.4. So, did nothing to suggest that in another spot it would have achieved greatness, but it never really had a chance. All right, and then this is our last one. It's kind of interesting to talk about Ringer. So this was a show that was piloted to CBS. CBS turned it down, and so CBS Studios then redid it and sold it to the CW. So kind of an interesting premise that it's a denied network show going to the smaller thing. So this was airing Tuesdays at 9 p.m. after 90210, and it debuts decently, right, at a 1.2, right, which is better than some of these other shows in the networks. But it's comically incompatible with 90210. And by the end of the season, it's doing 0.4s. Rating average is at a 0.6. And for something that started as something that was supposed to air on CBS, getting the budget low enough to make those numbers work wasn't going to happen. Right, so those are the scripted flops that occurred on there. Right? So, were any of these shows wrongly canceled? Do you remember any of them fondly? Right? I'm probably going to do another video discussing some of the returning shows during this time. But I hope you like it, and I'll see you next time.